Sir. My name is Shlomo Ovid, and today I'll be doing the final project for our group, Stop and Frisk. So, the goal of our project is to identify if there are trends or biases that have any influence in how the NYPD conduct their Stop and Frisk program. This is important because of how the NYPD must carry out this type of program and procedure in a fair way in order to prevent and fight crime. We feel that by analyzing the demographic of the people involved in stop and frisk, crime rates in New York City, and the population of different races and demographics in New York City, we may get more insight on these issues. So, the data that we're going to be using for this project is a little bit complex. We're going to be using 3 different databases in order to give us a more full and complete story and background of how this data relates to what we're trying to answer. So the datasets we're going to be using is the New York City Stop and Frisk database created by the NYPD, the crime rates in New York City, also created by the NYPD, known as NYPD CompStat, and lastly the demographics in New York City sorted by zip code. The New York City Stop and Frisk dataset, created by the NYPD, gives us information about how the stop and frisk procedure is carried out by the NYPD, and the main set of attributes that are used that are interesting for that dataset is the suspect's race and the suspect's crime description. That's what we're going to be mostly focusing on. And for crime rates in New York City, created by the NYPD, known as NYPD CompStat, this dataset gives us weekly information about different crimes within New York City and their frequency. The main attributes that are going to be of interest to us are the crimes being committed. Originally, the dataset only had the police precinct, and I took the liberty of using a Python script sorting the police precinct into borough, and I had it automatically add the borough as an additional column in the CSV file. And lastly, the current number of reports of the crime year to date. So in every week it has a year to date value that tells you how many incidents of that crime there are year to date. So we took that as an average to give us the overall year to date value. And then lastly, the demographics in New York City by zip code dataset gives us information about the demographics of population within New York City. The main set of attributes that are interesting here are the zip code, the borough, and the race. So if you wanted to look into it more, here are the sources of our data and the questions we're going to attempt to answer today. Is stop and frisk questioning specifically biased towards a certain race of people in New York City? If they are, what percentage of people that are being questioned are of the targeted race? Second, is stop and frisk in proportion to the different populations of the 5 boroughs in New York City? Third, are boroughs in New York City with higher crime being targeted for questioning? And lastly, how are race and types of crime related to one another? So the first question, we're going to specifically analyze the attributes of race, number of records, location, and demographic per area. For the second question, we're going to analyze location, demographic per area, and the number of records. For the third question, we're going to analyze the crime rates from CompStat, the demographic of the area, the location, and the number of records. And lastly, we're going to analyze the relationship between the race and the type of crime being committed. So, first question. So, we see firstly a chart like this. This is from the demographic by zip code dataset, and this gives us the demographic per borough per race. So, if you look, the first row gives us the color in red. Those bars give us the percentage of those people in every borough. So, for example, the Bronx has over 35% black. For Hispanics have over 35%. In white, in Brooklyn, it's also over 35%. In the Asian community, in Manhattan, it's a little less than 20%, and so on and so forth. So if we look at what we can gain from that data, is that we can see that there are high levels of blacks and Hispanics in the Bronx, right? You can see in the Bronx we have high levels of black and Hispanic. And in addition, there is a moderate level of blacks in Brooklyn, averaging over 10%, but high levels of white in Brooklyn, over 35%. Lastly, there's a significant black and Asian community in Manhattan, averaging over 10 and almost 20% respectively. This chart helps us give us some perspective before we compare this to the stop and frisk data set. So that's over here. Obviously, this data set looks quite different, and you can see that it doesn't even get over 22%. So, if we compare this slide to the previous slide, Brooklyn and Queens seem disproportionate to the community that is there. Over 20% of the stop and frisk in Brooklyn are black suspects, as you can see here, while the percentage of blacks in Brooklyn average slightly over 10%, right? If we go back, in Brooklyn, averages about 10 to 12%. So to see 22% here is a quite huge difference. In addition, about 15% of the stop and frisk in Queens are for black suspects, while the percentage of blacks in Queens are between 5 and 10%, right? So if we look here, for blacks in Queens, it's about 10%. Black suspects in Queens, it's about, about 10-ish%. And then if we go back to the original one, in Queens, we're really seeing between 5 and 10%. So it seems quite like a significant difference. Is stop and frisk in proportion to different populations of the 5 boroughs in New York City? So here we have the suspected race description when compared to the race as a percentage of the total number of records. So when we look here, the black community has over 60%. Over 60% of blacks are part of the stop and frisk. About 25% of whites, white Hispanic, which essentially means Hispanic, about 10% of white, about 2% Asian, so on and so forth. So if we compare that to the 2006-2008 American Communities survey for the U.S. Census, the percentages of the races in New York City are as follows. White has about 44.6%. When we compare this to the actual stop and frisk, that's a huge disparity, about 34%. When we do Hispanic compared to the actual number, it seems actually quite similar and quite telling. And the black community, there's about 25% in New York City in regards to population, but despite that, 60% of them are being stopped for stop and frisk. Right, so like we said before, over 55% of the stop and frisk is for black suspects, while black people only make up about 25% of New York City. Right, and here we're trying to compare, like we did before, the demographic per borough for stop and frisk and actual demographics, and we can see that it seems overall that the black community has much higher percentage of the total number of records when compared to the other communities, despite the actual demographic has a high level of all these people throughout the boroughs, but it seems that the target is mostly like the black community from the stop and frisk. Despite that, it's still difficult to give a concrete conclusion because I would need more data. It's difficult to get accurate data and a lot of data about race because not everyone is really willing to provide that information. So 3. Are boroughs in New York City with higher crime being targeted for questioning? So this is a chart based on NYPD's Comstat data set. So here we see the different crime percentages when compared to the actual percentages of people in that district, in that borough. Excuse me. So in Brooklyn, we have about 30% of the crime is from Brooklyn. with that, about 30% of the population is in Brooklyn. If we look in Manhattan, it's about 27%, I would say. And the average percentage of people in Manhattan is about 19.25% when you look at all of New York City. In Queens, we're seeing about 22%, when the actual percentage of Queens in regards to New York City is about 27%. In the Bronx, we're seeing a little over 15%, while the actual population is about 17%. And in Staten Island, we're seeing about 5% for crime and 5% for actual population percentage. So based on this graph, it seems kind of very proportional. And this is the kind of graph you would expect. So I wouldn't necessarily say that there's a target here for like certain boroughs aren't being targeted for crime. This seems to indicate that that's not the case, right? So here's just a more breakdown of what I said. So it seems that they're actually quite proportional when you're comparing these different percentages. So when we look at that, what's the difference here? Right, so when we compare the stop and frisk data set to the one we've seen previously, here we see that Brooklyn's about 30%, Manhattan's about 25%, Bronx is also about 22%, Queens is about between 15 and 20, and Staten Island's about 5. If we look and compare it to the previous data set, this seems also proportional. So I would venture to say that they aren't being targeted for specific crimes, and in fact this does seem proportional, and it's a good sign. We're not targeting high crime areas. Lastly, how are race and type of crime related to each other? So at first, when I did the graph for the stop and frisk data set, this seemed incredibly overwhelming. So what we did was I picked the top 5 suspected crimes instead, and the top 3 suspected races, to make the data much more easy to visualize. And then I took that and compared it with the CompStat data set. Okay, and I did the same reduction there. So what we can see from here is in the crime data set, 80% of the crime is petty larceny. Misdemeanor assault is about 45%. Grand larceny is also about 45%. Felony assault's about 20%, and about 12.5% is robbery. When we look at the stop and frisk data set, we can see that about 40% is criminal possession of a weapon, about 22% is robbery, about 16% is assault, 10-12% is criminal trespass, and lastly about 10% is petty larceny. So this may indicate to us that there are different ways in which these crimes are categorized for different data sets, or it may indicate that they're actually stopping people for different crimes, but it's still interesting to see that there's quite a big difference in percentages here. So to summarize, the stop and frisk dataset, along with the other datasets shown here, provide us with a deeper insight into how the stop and frisk procedure by the NYPD is implemented. The most prominent crimes in New York City. It gives us a view on the most prominent crimes in New York City and the racial geography of New York City. Based on the data we collected, there seems to be a disparity between the stops of certain races, even when compared to the population of the race within a borough at that moment. As a consequence, we are given this valuable insight into how stop and frisk is being implemented within the NYPD, and the disproportions found within these datasets are causes for concern and require further investigation to determine if stop and frisk is truly disproportionate to the race.